I thought you all were expecting that a German moderator is firing a pistol in the ceiling to start this session. Long time ago. We have no money for ammunition. I will briefly introduce, not very long, just 1 or 2 sentences, our 3 panelists, and start the way they are going to speak to us. Dieter Kolmer is a lieutenant colonel in the German Armed Forces, in the German Army actually, and he is a member of the Center for Military History and Social Sciences of the German Armed Forces. But what is the tradition in the center is he also teaches at the University of Potsdam. And it is, by the way, a delight. For an older historian, nothing is nicer than introducing younger, capable, intelligent historians, you know. Because a long time I thought I would be the only one, but it's nice if some youngsters are coming up and really are perfect historians. And we are very proud of them. And the same is true for Jörg Echternkamp, who also works at the Center for Military History and Social Sciences of the German Armed Forces and is also a professor at the Martin Luther University at Halle. And because we think this combination between doing research in the armed forces and also doing and teach is of high importance for an historian. And then we have I must say, an old friend. I don't mean old in the meaning of very old, but we know him for a long time, which is our General Major Gu Agyo, who comes from China, and we all know him for a long time. He's the commander of the Military Academy for Science Academy. And I just said he should be promoted now to Lieutenant Colonel, to Lieutenant General, because then he gets more pay, and then I would come and visit him because he has more money to entertain me, and he thinks it's a good idea, you know. So, you know, the topics they will be talking about, they all have 20 minutes and nothing more, and hopefully we do have time for some questions, because I think it's very necessary to have time for questions, and we have a translator, a friend of us, a colonel from the People's Republic Army in China too, and he will be helping translating if there are questions to our friend from China. So I would ask, without further ado, Dieter Kolmer to start with his paper. Dieter.
Yeah. Dear Professor Pomerin, thank you very much for your very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, professors, colleagues, comrades. It's an honor for me to be here. Sorry. I can try to speak louder, but I think that's better. Okay. It's an honor to be here at this place and this conference to hold a short lecture on behalf of the German delegation. Moreover, it's a great pleasure for me to talk about the Marshall Plan and its implications on West Germany. The Marshall Plan has always been a part of my life, ever since my father told me about his experiences with American soldiers as a young kid in Frankfurt. Being born in 1938, he was one of the typical German beneficiaries of the US economic policy after World War II. And consequently, he finally ended up working for the German-American Oil Gas Corporation, Esso, a subsidiary of Exxon. His oldest son became an exchange student to the United States. His magnificent year overseas was organized by Youth for Understanding, an exchange program for German students originally founded by the Marshall Plan. And my final history exam in high school was about the Marshall Plan. And to be honest, I could go on and on with personal experiences related to the Marshall Plan. So now you might understand why it is a very special occasion for me. In my lecture today, I will take a closer look at the Marshall Plan, of course, and how its basic intentions influenced the buildup of the West German Armed Forces. And here we are again. I'm part of the West German Armed Forces, and it influenced the resurgence of this part of our state. 2 plans that helped the new state to resurrect from the collapse of its predecessor. If we take a closer look at today's German armed forces, called Bundeswehr, it resembles professional military on a high level integrated into international organizations such as NATO and the European Union. Being part of a large number of international operations in the recent years, but not to forget being the cornerstone of the defense of Central Europe during the Cold War, shaped this army in the course of the past 63 years. The Bundeswehr was from its very beginning fully integrated into the democratic, pluralistic, and constitutional system of the Federal Republic of Germany. Having said that, the first steps are always the hardest. In particular, while creating a new state, especially after physically and morally devastating defeat in an illicit war. Not alone for the military, but for the German society as a whole. At the end of World War II, large parts of Europe were physically and economically ruined. A death toll of approximately more than 43 million had to be mourned. The survivors were exhausted, and the reputation of Germany seemed to be shattered forevermore. The main issue for the Allies in the summer of 1945 was how to rebuild the war-ravaged regions of the old world to be self-sufficient in the long run. And of course, in this context, the German case was a most controversial point. The question was how to deal with the population and the defeated nation as a whole. Different approaches were on the shortlist. Whatever the circumstances were, the main goal of the US administration was, quote, to keep starvation, disease, and civil unrest below such levels where they would pose a danger to the troops of occupation, as it was ordered in the Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067, which in the end would have meant something like a Carthaginian peace for Germany. Not before late 1946, and largely after the so-called hunger winter of 1946-47, the occupation forces in Germany realized that the German population had to be supplied with food and other necessities. Most notably for the simple reason, as the deputy military governor of Germany, General Lucius de Clay, illustrated it, quote, there is no choice between being a communist on 1,500 calories a day and a believer in democracy on 1,000 calories. At this point, officials in Washington understood that a starving German population would not be open for changes toward the intended installation of democratic institutions. After this dramatic development, not only in Germany, but in large parts of war-damaged Europe, and due to the urge of US media for action, the government in Washington responded finally and quickly. Secretary of State George C. Marshall announced in his famous address to the graduating class of Harvard University on June 5, 1947, quote, our policy is not directed against any country, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Any government that is willing to assist in recovery will find full cooperation on the part of the United States. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. Marshall was deeply convinced that only economic stability would provide political stability in Europe. He offered aid, but the European countries had to organize the program themselves. It was supposed to be capacity building. This was the start of the European Recovery Program to aid Western Europe, a program in which the United States provided over 13 billion US dollar, which is about more than 100 billion today. Those 13 billion in economic assistance and loans were to help to rebuild the European economies. Later, this concept was popularly called Marshall Plan, to honor its inaugurator. It was signed into a law by President Harry S. Truman on April 3, 1948, and finally benefited 17 European countries. France and Great Britain received by far the highest subsidy, more than 40% of the allocated funds. Germany received, after all, almost 1.4 billion, as well as the other former Axis powers, Italy, 1.5 billion, and Austria, 680 million US dollars. And as the American historian Michael J. Hogan put it, to rebuild war-torn regions, remove trade barriers, modernize industry, improve European prosperity, and prevent, and I think that's one of the most important points, the spread of communism. Until today, it is the German master narrative that the Marshall Plan was the foundation of the Wirtschaftswunder, which took place in the 1950s, and furthermore, to the solid economic and political development of the country to the present day. The plan was supposed to lead to capacity building among the European nations. With the allocated funds, the governments were asked to order needed goods in the United States. The American supplier was paid in US dollars, which were credited against the appropriate European Recovery Program funds. The European recipient, however, was not given the goods as a gift, but had to pay for them, usually on credit in local currency. These payments were kept by the government involved in a special counterpart fund. In Germany, it was the so-called Reconstruction Credit Institute, in German KfW Bank, which still exists today as the third largest bank in Germany. This counterpart money, in turn, could be used by the government for further investment projects. 5% of the counterpart money was paid to the US to cover the administrative costs of the Marshall Plan. Germany had to repay a part of the funds and debts from the pre-war area. However, this was an exemplary win-win situation. Germany received the goods needed, funded at a reasonable price, and the United States was able to utilize its industrial capacities to the full for the reconstruction of its new partners and allies. Even today, the compounded interest of the European Recovery Plan credits is used in Germany to fund startups. Being right at the borderline between East and West, the newly established superpowers, the United States, as well as the Soviet Union, were quickly seeking for solutions to get the German zones involved in the rising dispute between the democratic and communistic bloc. Both sides used their inherent methods to succeed. While the US administration set up the Marshall Plan, the Soviets bolstered the authorities in East Berlin with political propaganda and military equipment for the large paramilitary force. Despite the fact that the immediate aftermath of World War II, Germany was not allowed to establish new armed forces. The administration in Washington responded to the Soviet measures by, as newest historiographic insights argue, the push of the Pentagon for West German rearmament as early as 1948. However, it took the perceptions of the Korean War to convince the Truman administration in toto to change its policy in this particular case. The apprehension grew quickly that some similar communist aggression could take place in Europe. Consequently, the US government started in fall 1950 to advocate the armament of West Germany to substantially strengthen the defense of Western Europe. Since West Germany had no significant forces to protect its own territory and/or to support the Allied occupation forces properly, plans were set up to provide the new state its own army. US experts and NATO estimated approximately 600,000 soldiers were needed to protect the West German territory. Therefore, a largely quantity of conventional military goods was needed on a short-term basis. The former German armaments industry had changed its production since the end of World War II, mainly to civilian goods. For different reasons, it was not willing to invest in new equipment to manufacture military goods, even though the US government offered funds to do so. Even more, the German machine tool-making capacity, which had been massively expanded before and during World War II, was still utilized only by 60%. However, the vast economic development, the experiences of the past 30 years, the trials against some of the leading entrepreneurs of the armament industry, such as Krupp, and missing follow-up orders for military equipment led to the widespread unwillingness amongst the German industry to build up armament production capacities. Therefore, other solutions had to be found. One, of course, was to import goods from other European countries, such as France, Great Britain, Belgium, or maybe Switzerland. Having said that, those countries also used their industrial capacities to resolve their wartime destructions and for the reconstruction of their basic economies. Consequently, most of the arms-producing companies in those countries had a limited interest in supporting West Germany's effort to provide its new armed forces with the needed weapon systems. The comprehensive success of the Marshall Plan led American and German politicians to the conclusion that something similar could help to solve this problem. In 1951, the Mutual Security Act replaced the Marshall Plan. It was likewise implemented to support European democracies against the spread of communism. In the wake of this new initiative, Assistant Secretary of Defense Frank C. Nash came up with the idea to support West German armament with costless major equipment for 6 armies, 24 Air Force squadrons, and 18 minesweepers, worth about $1.1 billion US dollars, which is almost the same amount West Germany received in Marshall Plan funds. The so-called Nash Commitment was first discussed in early 1953 and offered to Chancellor Adenauer as soon as April 1953. The administration in Washington wanted to enable the West Germans to build up armed forces as quick as possible. However, this program was meant to be a precondition for German military capacity building and, of course, an opportunity, A, for the further use of the obsolete military material of the occupation forces still stationed in Europe, and B, to capture a new and fast-growing market for the US arms industry. The reaction of the German officials was somewhat astonishing. Of course, they were pleasantly surprised and agreed right away to this generous offer. At the same time, the build-up of the new army was quite costly. German officials reckoned up the costs for the first 5 years and figured out a financial gap of approximately $3 billion US dollars. Such being the case, they tried to negotiate a far more comprehensive support of their new American allies. The disappointment in Washington about these exaggerated German demands was bitter, and the reaction came right away. The newly elected Eisenhower administration asked for more and a fairer burden sharing between the United States and its European allies, with the effect that the Nash Commitment was cut and the so-called Nationalist contained only military material worth $904 million, a cutback of about 18%. Moreover, the US government asked Bonn to pay for every single tank, aircraft, and ship which was ordered additionally to the list. Still, West Germany received military material for about 4 army divisions, 18 Air Force squadrons, and 6 destroyers with supporting vessels. The only costs which had to be covered were the transportation expenses for those goods. Those arms bolstered the resurrection of the German armed forces, needed for the NATO strategy of deterrence along the borderline between the Eastern and Western Bloc. One page is missing. Good. Excuse me 1 second. One page of my speech is missing, I'm sorry. Without this help, the Bundeswehr would not have been able to fulfill its commitment to NATO for operational readiness in the early 1960s. Now, which were the major implications of Marshall Plan and the Nationalist? First of all, both served a dual purpose. The benefit of the US industry due to the fact that it needed markets to sell its surplus production, and the West German resurgence from the Third Reich and wartime destruction. Therefore, both measures helped the United States to stabilize the political and economic situation in Western Europe. Furthermore, large production capacities, which the United States built up during World War II, now lay idle. Both plans offered the chance to the US industry to utilize its capacities to the full, while especially West Germany used the subsidies to rebuild its own industry at a high level. And last but not least, during the Korean War, the US arms industry developed brand new weapon systems for its army. The Nationalists facilitated the US occupation forces to renew their major equipment while equipping a new ally with the used material. The West Germans, on the other hand, received their initial military material almost for free. The Marshall Plan and the Nationalists bolstered West Germany's economic and military build-up in the 1950s. The financial support, worth $2.3 billion was partly donated by the US government as a capacity-building strategy for all European countries which joined the Western Bloc. Exceptions to the rule were, of course, Austria and Sweden. Both stayed somewhat neutral during the Cold War. Both implemented measures were not altruistic. They basically assisted the American industry to gain foothold in Germany, not only as a door opener for major companies to a foreseeable new and profitable market, but also for lucrative procurement programs for the future re-equipment of the Bundeswehr. Moreover, morally, it obliged Germany to the United States, since it helped Germany to gain its position in the Western world. In retrospect, the American capacity building seemed to be designed as a win-win strategy that helped to weather the resurrection of both the new West German state and the Bundeswehr after the collapse of the Third Reich. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Colonel Dr. Kolmer. And now we continue with Professor Eitan.
Dieter? Well, first of all, let me say that I'm grateful to the organizers for accepting my proposal, to my superiors for making the participation possible, and to the moderator for introducing me as a younger historian, which is kind of refreshing when you're in your mid-50s. So, the birth of new states and the collapse of old empires, this is the central topic of our conference. And I start on the assumption that Germany is a case in point. West and East, the creation of two German states, West and East Germany in 1949, was inextricably linked to the outcome of World War II and to the collapse of the Nazi regime. For Germans in 1954, defeat not only marked a break in political and military terms, just as wars sometimes provide the opportunity for reforms that otherwise might have been implemented in peacetime, a lost war causes particular kinds of post-war transformations. Whereas victory lends itself to complacency sometimes, defeat often provides a post-war opportunity internally for self-criticism and externally for pressure by those who won the war for change, both of which can lead to reforms. In the West German case I will focus on, the creation of a post-war state can be interpreted as a renegotiation of the social order in the circumstances of Allied occupation. And you can see here, as a reminder, the situation of post-war Germany until 1949. Redefining the role of Germany after 1945 was not only a matter of foreign policy, though. of European integration or military alliances. It was also a problem of domestic policy, of social integration, and of civil-military relations. In my paper today, I will argue that it was during the first post-war decade that West Germans started to tackle the difficult task of creating a new democratic state. Generally, historians have considered World War II and Nazism as having constrained the reconstruction of Germany. My argument today kind of takes a contrary view, suggesting that conflicting interpretations of the experiences of war and of the period of occupation played a key role in negotiating and sustaining democracy, social stability, and a new role for the military in West German society. Thus, the emphasis of this talk will be on the public struggle over the past, that is, over the war, as a way towards peace in the future. I will elaborate on three types of conflict that took place mainly, though not exclusively, in the public sphere. Post-war trials, with an emphasis on the Nuremberg trials, prisoner of war, the POW question, and as a third aspect, the struggle over rearmament. And lastly, I will draw some conclusions about state building after wars. Now, let me start with the first aspect, the first dimension, the post-war trials. War crimes, crimes against humanity, and the role of the German army in these crimes, those were the object of a series of trials and military tribunals organized by the Allies after World War II. The Nuremberg trials called attention to the prosecution not only of the political elite of Nazi Germany, but of its military leadership as well. The International Military Tribunal, held in Nuremberg between November the 20th, 1955, and the 1st of October, 1956, made it particularly clear in which ways and to what extent the Wehrmacht was actively involved in wartime atrocities on the Eastern Front. The tribunal was a media spectacle of the first order. The so-called licensed newspaper, licensed by the Allies, provided their readers with an image of the war and its perpetrators that was impossible to reconcile with what the public had been fed by Nazi propaganda just a couple of months before. Germans' perception of the court proceedings were largely determined by the fact that the Allies were in charge of daily life under occupation, and that those same Allies sat in judgment on top-ranking German officials. This contributed to the general impression that Germany had hit bottom, both socially and morally, after the war. One of the few observers at Nuremberg was Felix von Eckart, who at the time was publisher and chief editor of the Bremen newspaper Weser-Kurier. And 20 years later, he still remembered the explosive synchronicity of judicial reckoning and social misery, which this picture gives you an impression of. In retrospect, Eckart referred to the winter of 1946 and 47, and Dieter Korma has just picked this up, as, quote, the most terrible ordeal that had been inflicted on the German people. In trial reports, which gave verbatim or paraphrased accounts of testimonies or interrogation segments, these licensed newspapers, such as the Süddeutsche Zeitung, confronted the public with graphic descriptions of the role of the Wehrmacht, its leadership and personnel. That is, in 1955-56, Germans could read about the war of aggression against the Soviet Union, about the systematic economic exploitation, especially of the occupied territories in Eastern Europe, and its disastrous impact on their economy. People could not only read that members of the Wehrmacht were engaged in Nazi propaganda during the last year of the war, but above all, that the Wehrmacht had been involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity in various ways. It became apparent, due to these new conditions of the post-war era, it became apparent that the Wehrmacht leadership knew about these crimes. Moreover, ordinary soldiers had been present while the crimes were committed and had provided logistical support during mass executions carried out by the Einsatzgruppen. This broad news coverage of the first Nuremberg trial, and this is my argument, was part of the Allies' policy of re-educating the Germans. They thought to exorcise the ghost of what they called militarism. However, even though many German civilians acquired a negative view of the military in those immediate post-war years, the Allies' hopes were undercut in a number of ways. Ironically, former Wehrmacht officers and generals were given a chance by their captors to launch their apologetics. The American Historical Division had asked them to write down their war experience, especially their war experience on the Eastern Front, an attempted transfer of military knowledge, so to speak. The general's vision of the war and the army's role in this war was part of their defense strategy in court, but also in a broader context of public discourse. The former military elite claimed, first, that they were not to blame for military defeat. Everything was Hitler's fault. And second, that the Wehrmacht had nothing to do with war crimes and crimes against humanity at all. Mass murder had been a matter for the SS and the Einsatzgruppen. Thus emerged an early counter-narrative. Did reports about the tribunal in the German press have an impact on historical awareness, on collective representations of the war and the military at all? The Office of Military Government for Germany, US, OMGUS, noted with satisfaction that, quote, the German people learned much recent history from the trials and thereby saw the Nazi period in sharper focus. I switch to my second aspect, the question of prisoners of war, POWs. A second set of issues that marked public debates in the new state of West Germany was generated by former Wehrmacht soldiers who had returned home and those who had not yet. On the one hand, there was the partly unresolved problem of war captivity. After 1945, and especially after 1948, when the bulk of German POWs were released, the reintegration of the discharged soldiers into the consumer society of the 1950s gave rise to the discussion about the pros and cons of comradeship, privation, and newfound freedom. The most contentious issue, however, concerned German POWs still held in the Soviet Union. It was not until 10 years after the war that the last 10,000 or so men returned home. The POW problem was a bone of contention not only in Cold War foreign policy, but it also concerned domestic policy, which is my focus. Until the mid-1950s, it continued to be a crucial political issue in West German society. At a time when there was no German army yet, those former soldiers locked away in Soviet labor camps couldn't be forgotten. Indeed, they were almost omnipresent among West German civilians. Of course, different forms of collective representations arose. Stems like this, national days of remembrance, traveling exhibits, they all kept the memories of those POWs alive. Veterans associations, we just talked about their impact on post-war society. Veterans associations in particular made sure that the POWs were not forgotten. Nevertheless, the self-organization of veterans, which had become possible after the Allies lifted the ban on such organization in the Federal Republic, provided the framework for a more complex veterans culture. Institutional associations on the local, the regional, and national level, independent publishers, and individuals gave homecoming POWs the opportunity to contribute to the public debate in various ways. In effect, they allowed them to shape their own integration into society. Here, a key role was played by the National Association of Returning Soldiers, the German name of the organization Verband der Heimkehrer, literally referred to soldiers coming home. Some of the former Wehrmacht personnel formed what can be described as a community of shared experience. Their interpretation of the past involved distancing themselves from other competing communities of shared war and post-war experience, such as refugees, displaced persons, and former inmates of concentration camps. Former soldiers by no means perceived themselves as merely the victims of history, nor did they present themselves as such to the public. Suffering and performance were two sides of the same coin. In fact, many former POWs considered them and presented them as experts of freedom because they had experienced the opposite. To be sure, veterans were not the only ones who had experienced extreme violence. From the very beginning, they had to share their sorrows with millions of other Germans affected by the war. Therefore, they soon adopted the self-image as victims, which most Germans created for themselves and which special interest groups refer to when formulating claims for compensation. While all Germans had suffered as a result of war itself, others had, as they saw it, suffered disproportionately from the consequences of the war. For example, through denazification, through the restitution of Aryanized, so-called Aryanized property, and through the dismissal of civil servants and judges from civil service. Now, what about the fallen soldiers? 10 years after the end of the war, the Federal Republic still lacked a national monument to the dead and a universal commemoration ritual. That, of course, had a lot to do with the division of the nation. Instead, it had local sites of memory and varying forms of remembrance. With the introduction of a national holiday to be celebrated 2 weeks before the first Sunday of Advent for the first time in 1952, the state finally provided a recurring occasion to commemorate the war dead. At a time when Bonn was the capital, a long time ago, of West Germany, one of the city's cemeteries, the Nordfriedhof, was chosen for the official wreath ceremonies. Since the 1950s, the new national holiday has been observed by the Bundestag, our parliament, the parliaments of the federal states, and many German municipalities. And this brings me to my third and last aspect, the question of rearmament. A third set of issues, centered on a change in Germany's security policy, triggered further public debates, and these too involved the Wehrmacht's role in the new Germany and the legacies of war. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 convinced Western governments of the increasing threat of international communism. Only 5 years after experiencing total war, unconditional surrender, and demilitarization, West Germany began to contribute to her own defense with encouragement from the United States. This was mentioned already in Dieter Kolmar's paper. Rearming the Germans, though, worried their neighbors, especially France, but it also worried many Germans themselves. While the conservative government developed plans to build up a new German Wehrmacht, as today's Bundeswehr was first called, others took to the streets. The German soldiers could not be reinvented, they cried. A new military signified to them either World War II and Hitler's army or a possible World War III and an anonymous new Wehrmacht. In October 1950, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer gathered former generals for a secret meeting of experts at Himmerod Abbey in the Eifel mountain range. I will not go into the details of this meeting, but that was the first step in this development to make the ambivalences very clear between sticking to the past and building something new. Former officers and generals considered it necessary to mediate in the issue of the internal organization of new armed forces between what they called, quote, the justified desire for the traditional regard for the soldier in the public, end of quote, on the one hand, and, quote, the necessary new contents and relaxed forms on the other. Soldiers were to have a clear, positive image of Europe, which was understood in a normative way as the place where political values of self-determination and social justice had been born and should be maintained. and it was the task of the military to defend those values. The new shared European identity was to be accompanied by, quote, a healthy patriotism, and those who defended Western Europe were also now defending, quote, the German homeland and family. Ambivalence toward the past became more apparent in the public. The public relations campaigns of the Federal Ministry of Defense and its clandestine predecessor, the Amt Blank, is a case in point. To make rearmament more acceptable, advertisements for the new soldier presented soldiers in a modern, civilized ways, as my colleague at the center, Thorsten Loch, has shown in his dissertation. Between the tenaciousness of tradition and the need for reform, army reformers conceived of a new philosophy of military leadership known as the internal leadership, the innere Führung. So there were all kinds of debates going on how to conceive of a new army on the condition of the lost war, the collapse of the Nazi regime, and the necessity to rearm Germany as part of the alliance against the East. Since the 20 minutes are drawing to a close, I will come to my conclusion. The West German case can be taken as an example of the complexity of transitions from the collapse of an old regime to the creation of a new state, of transitions from war to peace. Transformations from war to post-war began during the last phase of the conflict and continued well into the 1960s. But those early post-war years of state building marked a discrete period of fundamental change. Yet the violence of war was not simply pushed aside and superseded by a future-oriented public debate. Rather, recent military experience of active violence, but also passive violence, played a key role in this process of reorientation. The fact that Germany had lost the war and that this outcome was indisputable had a tremendous influence on post-war state building. It was not only the end of the war and the war itself and its consequences as such, however, that had an impact on the creation. What turned out to be equally, if not more important, were the ways in which the war and its effect were experienced, and that means interpreted. Interpretations of the past, rather than the objective past, had an impact on Germany's post-war reconstruction, and thus on German democratization. The objective aftermath of war nevertheless elicited different interpretations too. My thesis is, to conclude, that the controversial public debates on soldiers, on crimes, on POWs, on rearmament, laid a cultural groundwork for establishing pluralism and democracy in West Germany. Of course, these interpretations of war were not carved in stone. West Germans addressed them from new perspective when the political, social, and most of all cultural situation changed in the 1960s and 1970s. But that is a different story. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience, and I will be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Eitan. And now it's the turn of General Q Agio from China. Please.
Okay.
If you don't know, this is not the general. The general is sitting right here. This is the translator of the general, which is nice. As a general, one has lots of things, we have translators, adjutants, and so he is more fluently in English, and this is why he is giving the paper now for the general, but here's the real man.
So, as the moderator said, for saving our time, I have to read Major General's presentation in English instead of Chinese. And in the QA scenario, and the Major General is more willing to answer your questions. The Chinese People's Liberation Army, abbreviation is CPLA or PLA, was born in Nanchang Uprising on August 1, 1927. Experienced with workers and peasants Red Army, the Road Army, the New Fourth Army, and the Liberation Army. CPLA defeated the powerful enemies at home and abroad under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, which has played an irreplaceable historic and practical role by making great achievements in Chinese Revolution, the founding, constructing, and reforming of the People's Republic of China, and maintaining the world peace as well. Firstly, the CPLA has made great achievements in the war of fighting for national independence, the liberation of the people, and the establishment of the new China. China was in a semi-colonial and semi-feudal society when CCP was founded on July 1st, 1927. The masses of the people were living hard as in hot water under the cruel rule of imperialism and bureaucratic capitalism. It was a real thing in the world about the poverty and the lack of freedom of the Chinese people. The principal contradictions in modern Chinese society was the contradiction between the imperialism and the Chinese nation, the feudalism and the masses of people as well. The Chinese people and the proletarians were not able to carry out the revolution and seize the power by peaceful means, as reactionary ruling forces imposed white terror and bloody repression on the revolutionary forces. In order to realize the national independence, democracy, and freedom, China had to take the road of armed struggle. As said by Mao Zedong, in China, the status of proletariat, of the people, of CCP, and the victory of revolution will all end in naught without the armed struggle. To seize the power by taking the road of armed struggle, China had to establish a new form of People's Army in its revolution, which Chinese Communist Party was lack of experience in the early stage of its founding. The failure of the Great Revolution taught the communists a bitter lesson, which led to the Nanchang Uprising, the Autumn Harvest Uprising, and the Guangzhou Uprising. Then came to the new stage of the founding of the Workers' and the Peasants' Red Army. The forces left from all the armed uprisings from all over the country had become the initial resources and the backbones of the People's Army, which ignited the sparkles of China's Revolution War and set the whole country on fire. Under the guidance of Mao Zedong's thought of power comes from the barrel of a gun, the CPC created and firmly controlled the People's Army. After a long and arduous armed struggle, the CPC led the Workers' and the Peasants' Red Army in land revolution period, the 8th Road Army and the New Fourth Army in anti-Japanese war period, and finally the CPLA overthrew imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucratic capitalism, won the victory of new democratic revolution, and then established the People's Republic of China. China has become a truly independent socialist country from a semi-colonial and semi-feudal country, and its people have become the owner of its nation. Secondly, the CPLA has provided a strong support for safeguarding national sovereignty, security, and development interests. With the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the tasks of the CPLA took a historic transformation from seizing the power to defending the state power of the people's democratic dictatorship, participating in the socialist revolution and construction, realizing the national reunification, preventing and fighting against the aggressions of imperialism and hegemonism. In the decades since the establishment of New China, the Chinese peaceful foreign policy has won the appreciations and the support of all countries in the world. However, some countries nibbled Chinese territory in a certain time. Some countries sent their troops to violate Chinese airspace, territorial water, and border areas. Chinese government had to make the decisions of self-defense counterattacks after repeated restraint and forbearance, followed the principle of advantage, reason, and restraint. the CPLA was ordered to resolutely fight back against the intruders, which safeguarded Chinese sovereignty over its secret territory, territorial water, and territorial airspace, and maintained the dignity of the Chinese nation as well. The CPLA has successively carried out the operations of fighting against the United States and assisting the North Korea, the operations of China-Myanmar border demarcation guards, the operations of self-defense counter-attack in China-India borders, the operations of fighting against the United States and assisting Vietnam, the operations of self-defense counter-back in the Shisa Islands, the operations of self-defense counter-attack in China-Vietnam borders, etc. Those combats and operations vigorously safeguarded China's sovereignty, consolidated China's political power, and defended China's security. In the period of Cold War, the CPLA had made a full preparation for the World War and a timely strategic deployment when China's security environment deteriorated, which contained the possible invasion. At the same time, the CPLA had set up the power of nuclear deterrence with its own efforts in extremely difficult circumstances, which broke the nuclear monopoly and the nuclear blackmail of the superpower, improved China's international position, and deterred any attempts to invade China. Thirdly, the CPLA is an irreplaceable major force in national rescue and relief work. China is a country with a vast territory and frequent natural disasters. The huge destructive effect of disasters will become practical and potential huge damage for the national economic construction and the people's life and property, which will directly constrain the social and economic development, and sometimes it will even be an indirect cause of social unrest. The armed forces can make a quick response for the disaster, which is good organization and its quick maneuverability. The CPLA has played an important role in the disaster relief and the protection of people's life and property, which is an irreplaceable major force in national rescue and relief work. The CPLA has always regarded the interests of the people above anything else. To win the operation of disaster relief has been always regarded as the most urgent and important political task for the CPLA in emergency, when people's life and property are threatened seriously. All the behaviors of the CPLA in Tangshan earthquake rescue in 1976, flood relief in 1987, and earthquake relief in 2008 have demonstrated their spirit that the People's Army is for the people. In the flood relief in 1998, the CPLA and armed police sent 300,000 troops of 66 divisions or brigades and armed police corps, altogether transformed 4.2 million people, repaired and reinforced the dikes, about 7,260 kilometers. Especially in 2008, China suffered the snow disaster in the southern in the beginning of the year, and heavy earthquakes on 12 May in Wenchuan areas of Sichuan province. The troops of the CPLA and armed police saved lives at all costs by regarding the people as their parents, finished their tasks with high standards under the command of the Chinese Communist Party by regarding the interests of people above all, and won the high praise and support of the Chinese people. Fourthly, the CPLA has played an important role in maintaining the world peace and promoting common development. Peace, development, coordination, win-win are the themes of our era. Although the regional and the world war will not happen in a short period of time, the international society is still facing with a series of new security threats and challenges. The relationship between China and the world has made a historic change with its transforming and opening policy. China has entered the world political political and economic stage with unprecedented vigor. Under such situations, the CPLA has actively participated in the operations of fighting terrorism, pirates, cross-border crimes, and peacekeeping and disaster reliefs, so as to undertake the important responsibility for providing common products for international security, maintaining the world peace, and promoting the common development. CPLA has participated in 24 UN peacekeeping operations since 1990 and sent over 35,000 peacekeeping personnel, which is the nation that sent the largest number of the personnel of the 5 permanent states in the UN. It has constructed and repaired the road for 13,000 kilometers, and 9,400 landmines and explosives of various types, transported materials for 1.2 million tons, treated more than 117,000 patients. There are 2,720 China's troops now on duty in 9 UN peacekeeping task areas, such as in Liberia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Lebanon, etc. In those areas, they are conducting the peacekeeping tasks of security guarding, roads repairing, bridges constructing, medical treating, and material transportation. CPLA has carried out over hundreds of military exercises with foreign military forces since 2002, including the joint counterterrorism exercise with members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, joint maritime search and rescue exercises with Pakistan, India, France, England, and Australia, etc. China's Navy has continuously sent 22 fleets, 83 warships, and 22,000 troops to the Gulf of Aden and Somalia since the first fleet departed on 26 December 2008, escorted 6,500 vessels on 1,000 separated occasions, successfully rescued and escorted and helped over 60 Chinese and foreign vessels, identified and warned away more than 3,000 suspected pirate ships, successfully completed the emergent missions of evacuating the Chinese people from Libya and Yemen, who is guarding the Chinese people in the Blue Sea and carrying the genes and ideas of peace to the peace-loving people of all over the world with practical actions. So thank you for your attention.
But I think we could allow one question or two, because some people have to run, you know, to get rid of their jackets and jump into the bus to go out. But please, don't hesitate to ask a question. Go ahead.
Randy Papadopoulos from the United States. A question for both Randy Papadopoulos from the United States. A question for Drs. Kollner and Eitan. Neither one of you mentioned the European defense community, which was an alternative to German rearmament, and I wonder what role you see in the case of the Marshall Plan, as that is an alternative that perhaps would have precluded American support to the development of the West German military, and conversely a way of normalizing the German military in an international sense, and how that might have played a different role, or made a different West German military after the Second World War.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful question. One needs for the answer an hour. Okay, next question.
I'd like to ask about the role of the Chinese Navy, really, and maritime power in view of the One Belt, One Road strategy. How would you think the PLA would change in light of the new strategy of the One Belt, One Road?
Okay, we take these two questions. Why don't you use this phone, Mr. Eitan? Here, write this one, so you don't have to run away.
Okay. So if I'm trying to integrate the European defense community and your question into my argument, then one could, in fact, elaborate on this first attempt to sort of deal with German soldiers on a European level. And I think it would fit in my argument to say that it perfectly reflects the different perceptions of the German soldier, past and future, the fear of certain countries, especially France, the importance of the idea of Europe, which I slightly mentioned in my paper. So it's not by chance that the first idea was, if we will have new German soldiers, then they should be part of a European defense community with a contingent rather than an independent all-German army. So I would pick up your point and integrate this into this public debate, international debate in this case, rather than just national, on what to do with German soldiers and the role of Europe as a framework for the militarization or remilitarization, as the critics say.
Dieter Kollmann.
Yes, the question is not about personnel, but about the material for the military, of course. The European defense community wouldn't have changed anything. The Americans wanted to support the Germans to build up their military, and they needed material anyway. The Americans also, of course, wanted to be part of further re-equipment of the Bundeswehr. So the Nationalist or the Nash commitment would have taken place anyway. By the way, the Americans first favored the European defense community, especially since the Americans wanted the Europeans to give a little bit more, not only personnel, but also money-wise, material, and of course, make the Europeans feel that they also have responsibility for defending themselves.
Okay, question to the lady.
我来回答大家的问题，但是我还需要谢峰中校的翻译。
So I will I'll go there. So I'd like to answer your questions, but I need Colonel Xie's assistance because I am his interpreter.
一带一路是中国提出倡导，并且的话正在大力推进的一个经济和社会的发展战略，但是它不是一个军事战略。
So as you know, the Belt and Road Initiative was called forth by the Chinese government, and it's economic and development initiative. It's not a military strategy.
它的目的是寻求和在“一带一路”这样一个大的经济圈之内，和这个各国人民一同寻求一种经济和社会的发展，而不是的话寻求一种新的军事部署。
In the long run, the Chinese government, China, to seek harmony, society, and all the combination and connection with the neighboring countries. They also need the economic and social development by the Belt and Road Initiative. It's not a military deployment.
所以的话，中国人民解放军，包括中国人民解放军海军，并不寻求在相当一个时期之内，并不寻求自己在国际事务中的角色改变。
So in a world, the CPLA, especially the PLA Navy, will not seek a military strategy change in the world. We will not change our military strategy. Thank you.
So I thank all the participants, and people who know me long enough know that I cannot close the session without a little remark. The word rearmament is something I hate to hear, because a new country, a new state, the Federal Republic of Germany, could not be rearmed. It was not existing before. And the armed forces I joined in '61 were completely different from the Wehrmacht before. It was following different principles like military leadership, which was mentioned, and also internal leadership was called innere Führung. And one should keep in mind, rearmament was always used as a word Wiederbewaffnung of the enemies of the armament of the Federal Republic. So I would love if people would prefer the word arming the whatever, but avoid rearmament. It brings you back into Wiederbewaffnung, and it's the wrong thing to do. And I'm proud that I joined when I was 17, a completely different army in a new country. Thank you very much.